EDU-ARCTIC 2, Polar Research for Education, innovative program in Poland and Norway. Webinars.
Today we're going to talk about Arctic phytoplankton, and this is part one, actually, of two parts dedicated to plankton in the Arctic, and the second part is, of course, zooplankton in the Arctic. Both educational toolkits are already uploaded and available on our website, GRASP platform. So I hope maybe some of you already had an opportunity to use them. Maybe you can share some ideas and give some feedback to what we prepared. And this webinar is supposed to be a little bit of a wrap up of what is the content of the toolkits on one hand, and on the other hand, it also can be treated as an introduction to the whole topic. So let's start. The phytoplankton in general, not only Arctic phytoplankton, is, or maybe I should say, are based, the very first link of numerous food webs, chains, food webs, we should rather say, and these food webs were, of course, aquatic food webs. It is, in general, it's a group of microorganisms, and it consists of about 5,000 known species. And most of those species, most of those organisms, float mostly close to the surface of water. Phytoplankton include, for example, diatoms, cyanobacteria, green algae, or dinoflagellates. They live in, like I said, close to the surface of the water, so they live in the euphotic zone of the ocean or any other water body, which ranges, this zone ranges from, it depends on the region and also the time of the year, but in general it's up to 300 meters below the surface, which seems a lot. It doesn't mean that through the whole zone there is the same amount and the same availability of sunlight, no, but still to some extent photosynthesis is possible in this zone, at least when the sunlight is available, which in the Arctic is not always the case. And these microorganisms are a huge biomass, which can be, of course, found in the ocean, but actually their presence was mostly unnoticed for a very, very long time, at least most of those tiny organisms. And only since the 1970s, so not that long ago, thanks to some modern research, we understand and we appreciate more the role of phytoplankton. So like I said, the phytoplankton are organisms that drift in the water. It means that they have little control over the movement. Unlike, for example, plankton, which are swimmers like whales, fish, and calamars. And this is actually the difference between I mean, this is a specific of the phytoplankton that in general, plankton is drifting in the water. Zooplankton and phytoplankton, both groups, cannot control their movement in the water, and the phytoplankton even less than zooplankton. And this phytoplankton, this subgroup of plankton, are, like I said, photosynthetic organisms. That means they conduct a process called photosynthesis, which are cyanobacteria, green algae, diatoms, dinoflagellates, euglanins, and other groups. Those groups differ significantly, and the whole phytoplankton group is a very diverse group. So in general, one category includes unicellular algae. They're known as protists, and they're advanced cells similar to protozoa, but they're protists. And these forms include diatoms, like I said, which we can see here, like the sketch of the diatom, of course. And they're mostly abundant near coast, especially diatoms are abundant near ocean coast. And another type of phytoplankton cells, which are more primitive, but also very, very numerous, are photosynthetic bacteria. And they are very tiny cells, some as small as microns in diameter, so really, really small. And they seem to be invisible, but are present in hundreds and thousands of cells, like in each and every tablespoon of ocean water. They are, at least those photosynthetic bacteria, are too small to be caught in any web. And like I said, they were, especially the small ones, were totally unknown until the 1970s, when there was an improved technology that made them visible. And now scientists know that these photosynthetic bacteria are responsible for a lot, at least half of the original productivity of the ocean. And some say that they're the most abundant organisms in the sea. Just like in case of zooplankton, some organisms like Calanus glacialis are said to be the most abundant animals in the world in terms of number of individuals. So this group of photosynthetic bacteria also includes cyanobacteria, which are considered to be one of the oldest organisms on Earth. So we have a lot of very special organisms in this group, and they're said to be ancestors of photosynthetic organelles in plant cells. That means that they were ancestors of chlorophyll. So there are also green algae, and they belong to another group, Zoophyta. And in these green algae, the photosynthetic pigments, green pigments, are present. And the photosynthetic pigments are, the green ones are chlorophyll, A and B, also some orange and red, orange and yellow pigments like carotene or xanthophyll. So the cyanobacteria are very importantly, like I said, they are one of the oldest organisms on Earth, and they played a very significant role in shaping the Earth, actually, the course of evolution and the ecological change throughout the Earth's history. So the oxygen atmosphere that we mostly depend on was probably created by numerous cyanobacteria during some old times, like archaic and Proterozoic epochs. So previously the atmosphere had a completely different composition, chemical composition, and it would be unsuitable for life as we know it today. So that phytoplankton played a very significant role in shaping the Earth. Not only it still plays this very important role, but in the past it was a crucial role, sort of a breakthrough to create so much oxygen in the photosynthesis process to make the atmosphere completely different. What else about those groups? Well, some like diatoms, for example, again they live in sort of we could say that they live in tiny houses made of glass. Actually, it's not glass, it's silica, but we could say that they live in tiny glass houses. And they are actually the only organisms on the planet that have cell walls made of this transparent silica. And you can see that those cell walls are like decorated, like engraved with some amazing combinations of patterns. So this is why we also in our materials we will often come back to diatoms as one of the most extraordinary organisms belonging to a phytoplankton group. So this is what they looked like, of course, under a microscope, at least some of them, some representatives. But let's remember we are talking specifically about Arctic phytoplankton. That means we need to go to the Arctic Ocean. And like I said, plankton lives obviously in water. And today we're talking specifically about this marine plankton living in Arctic areas. Of course, it also lives in fresh water and actually in any moist environment, more or less. And the Arctic Ocean creates a very specific environment for many reasons. For example, it's the shallowest of all the oceans. That means that the mean depth is less than 1.5 kilometers, which is not allowed for the ocean. It's the shallowest of all the oceans, and it has large continental shelves. So it consists of a deep ocean basin in the center, and then there are those shelves, continental shelves, and shelf seas. So there's Barents Sea, Kara Sea, Laptev Sea, Siberian Sea, Chukchi, Beaufort, Greenland Sea, and so on, so on. Lots of those shelf seas, which are pretty shallow. So it's not only the shallowest of all the oceans, but like I said, it has significantly larger continental shelves than all the other oceans. So the conditions in the Arctic Ocean, I think we can imagine that the water is pretty cold. So the temperature of the upper Arctic Ocean is quite constant, actually, close to the freezing point of seawater, which is, of course, below zero. So since the Arctic Ocean is made up of salty water, not fresh water, the temperature must reach like minus 1.8 degrees with this type of solution before it actually freezes. And this is one thing. So it's pretty cold, and it's pretty cold all the time. Another thing is access to nutrients. So access to nutrients in the Arctic Ocean is highly dependent on the mixing of water layers. If the layers mix, there is new input of nutrients. If the layers do not mix at all, well, there's a problem. There's also a very limited access to light, especially during polar night over the Arctic Circle. So this is one thing that influences the amount of sunlight available to phytoplankton, which needs sunlight to produce, for example, oxygen in photosynthesis process. But also there is sea ice. So once the water reaches temperature below 1.8 Celsius degrees, of course it freezes. This is how the sea ice is formed, more or less. And the sea ice also limits the amount of sunlight that is available for photosynthesis process. So this is another thing. So it's cold. It's not very rich in nutrients, or maybe not exactly so. The availability of nutrients depends on how layers mix. The availability of sunlight is very diverse, and depends on the season, because when it's polar night, then there's absolutely no sunlight available. And the stratification, as you can see here, is quite interesting. So we have this mixed layer, which is called fresh. Underneath we have halocline, which is like this very stable cold layer of water because of temperature, but also because of salinity gradient, which influences how dense the water is. Going deeper, we have this Atlantic water, which comes from the Atlantic, and it's rather warm. It's not very warm, but it's warm in comparison. It's rather saline. And underneath, we have Arctic deep water. And the main freshwater source that enriches the Arctic Ocean are rivers. So the Arctic Ocean receives quite a lot, because about 11% of the global runoff of fresh water from rivers. So there are fresh water from rivers. There's also rainfall, and the ice, the ice that melts finally. The low salinity water comes from the Pacific Ocean, and the deeper water masses are formed by the transformed waters of the Atlantic, thus Atlantic water, warm and sour. So, like I said, there is a deep Arctic Ocean basin, and it's surrounded by seas, which are shelf seas, which are rather shallow seas, and the so-called productivity differs significantly from between the seas. As you can see here, this is a figure from an actual scientific paper, which we also tend to try to use a lot in our educational toolkits. So in a toolkit, there is a task for the students to find differences of productivity between those seas, and the trick here is to see that the scale is different, and this is not the same scale. The scale for years is the same, because it starts in 1998 and then goes right to 2006. But the scale of the productivity, which is so-called annual primary productivity, is different, and depends on many factors, and also, as you can see here, it's different between years, so it may vary between years. But the major limiting factors of this productivity, which is of course the amount of, when we say it's an amount of organic matter, it's not exactly so, but the organic matter produced by phytoplankton, there are two limiting factors, like I said, the sunlight and the nutrients. So this means that based on those differences, we can sometimes determine what are the conditions in a specific part of Arctic Ocean. There are several interesting phenomena that are related to Arctic Ocean and what happens in this ocean thanks to or due to the presence of phytoplankton. So we can start with so-called biological pump, which some argue is one of the most important processes, one of the most important phenomena on our planet, and it allows us to live. As actually, it's pretty scary to know how many complicated processes that go on without us even knowing it or intervening. How many of them influence our life so much that without it, it would be completely impossible, at least in the form that we know. So the biological pump is one of them, and it is strictly related to the phytoplankton, and it's especially intense in Arctic regions. So the biological pump is a process that leads to long-term storage of carbon in the ocean depths. That's the pump. So we might say that it sucks the CO2, carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere, and through a chain of events, it allows it to be stored long-term in the depths. So the key actors are, of course, phytoplankton, those organisms that that use the CO2 in the process of photosynthesis. So they use the CO2 and produce the organic matter in photosynthesis. And then, of course, as each and every other organism, they eventually die. And if they die, they no longer resist, and they no longer stay drifting in upper layers of water. They pretty much just sink. And when they sink, they reach the ocean bottom, and then they are stored as in different forms, in various forms. Actually, we can see that there are different types of this pump, like so-called hard pump and soft pump. So if carbonate, calcium carbonate is produced, then we say it's hard pump, and it's soft pump when it's organic carbon that's sinking along with dying phytoplankton. And as for the calcium carbonate, they are mostly those shells of different oceanic organisms. But why is it so important? Well, it is said that without the biological pump process, so without the activity of phytoplankton, our level of CO2 in the atmosphere would be 200 ppm higher, which is a lot, which is definitely a lot. If we're observing each and every increase in the CO2 level, and now we've reached more than 400 ppm. But let's imagine that there would be 200 more ppm. So life as we know it would be completely impossible. That also means, unfortunately, that we have a sink full of potentially dangerous carbon that could be released. As long as the oceans are in more or less in a balance, it works. That means it is not released at all. Of course, the biological pump doesn't work the same way in each and every region, but in general, the Arctic regions are especially of very special importance because of the phytoplankton that lives there on one hand, but also on the other hand, the temperature of water plays the role. So along with biological pump mechanism, there is also a physical pump, we might say. So the CO2 is soluble easier in cold water than in warm water. So there is a double impact of Arctic regions. If anything happens in Arctic regions, if phytoplankton, if there's any disruption in the phytoplankton community, and on the one hand, on the other hand, when the water is warmer, this can disrupt this pump phenomena significantly. Another thing that is a very important feature of the Arctic phytoplankton in comparison with other phytoplankton communities is seasonality. Like I said, I already mentioned the polar night, so we have polar night and polar day. It doesn't mean it's always 6 months of polar night and 6 months of polar day. That's only pole region, North Pole region. But still, there is some period when there's absolute lack of light, and this seasonality is also a type of very specific balance that, if disrupted, could really cause serious mismatch with other cycles. But let's start with spring. Well, actually, it's winter, late winter or early spring, or in the Arctic, when sunlight appears or reappears for the first time. For example, in Hornsund, Svalbard, where our polar station, our Polish polar station is situated. The sun first reappears on Valentine's Day, so the 14th of February. So we might say this is the start of sort of springtime in the region. Of course, it differs from one region to another. So when the polar night ends, then the light intensity increases. Of course, well, the sun reappears, and this ice, the sea ice, begins to melt. Then, as a consequence, we have an ice melting period, which is a very, very intense period and a very important one for the Arctic phytoplankton. So when this thawing or melting begins, first of all, there is even more availability of sunlight for the phytoplankton because there's no barrier, because of course ice has a higher albedo and it reflects the sunlight, while the darker surface of water, it attracts sunlight and it absorbs a lot of energy. So it's a mechanism that accelerates itself, we might say. So this is one thing, that there is more sunlight, and another thing that there are lots of nutrients that appear. And you remember that these two factors, sunlight and nutrients, were the limiting factors of productivity of Arctic Ocean. And where do they come from, those nutrients? So simply the water that is produced when sea ice melts is like enriched with various organisms that were trapped in the sea ice while the water was freezing and creating the sea ice. And also there is new input, currents, coastal runoff, and so on and so on. This is also why the numbers vary from one sea to another, because that depends on what the coastal runoff brings. Then, after the sunlight reappears and the ice begins to melt, there is a total life explosion, and the Arctic spring and Arctic bloom, not only on land but in the ocean in particular, is like nothing else. It's hard to compare with anything. I mean, because it's so intense, and after the period of total pause and total decline, it's really, really very intense. This life explosion is actually quite a short period. It also depends from region to region, but it's very, very prolific. The primary production is very, very high. Both there are ice algae and phytoplankton. There are lots of blooms, and it starts in April, usually in the southern parts. And but in the northern parts, this very short period of spring, can begin as late as September in the furthest north. So that means that the actual bloom, the actual productivity period is very, very short. So this is life explosion. This spring, Arctic spring, is like a theater of the most intense primary productivity. Then we have summer, and the production is not as intense as it was just right after the ice melting. So the productivity is declining slowly. There are some occasional blooms, more local blooms sometimes, and inevitably darkness comes back and the decline comes back, and the total pause of basically almost any life. And for the phytoplankton, it's the absolute decline, because there is no light. Without light, the algae and planktonic algae, they just stop growing completely. So the second feature or phenomenon that I want to stress was the seasonality. So the first was biological palm, then we have seasonality, which is especially visible in the Arctic, more than any other region in the world, I would say. And also these spring blooms are really, really intense. And the third phenomenon that I wanted to present, actually it's more complex. So as for the phenomenon, but let's start with those abbreviations. So we have DMS and CLAW. Let's start with DMS. What is DMS? So it simply means dimethyl sulfite. So it's produced by phytoplankton, and generally it's pretty harmless, and it's produced at pretty low concentration. I know that for some of you it might seem a little strange. What is DMS, the dimethyl sulfite? But I bet that if you ever walked along any seashore, you know one thing about DMS, which is the smell of DMS. It is, for some people, it's slightly unpleasant odor, and it reminds me a little bit of like cooking corn, boiled cabbage, something like that, like certain types of seafood as well. But this is what the sea smells like. When you think smell of the sea, it's like the key ingredient, and that is instantly recognized. So it's not produced artificially, it's produced naturally, like I said, by certain types of phytoplankton. So it would be natural to think that if there is more phytoplankton, then more DMS is produced and the concentration of DMS increases. So DMS has a lot of effects, we might say, but some of the effects are of the specific importance or evoke very strong interest in this process. So when the concentration of DMS increases because there's more phytoplankton, because there is more sunlight, because there are more nutrients, and this is more or less related to climate change, climate warming in general, especially in these regions. That means that when there's more DMS, but one of the effects of DMS is more clouds, because it has some effect on cloud formation, because these are little particles around which the clouds are formed. So the cloud formation is enhanced when there are more of those concentration nuclei, we might say, which are DMS. So if DMS concentrations, especially in the Arctic, continue to rise, it could change the cloud formation, the patterns of cloud formation, especially in the Arctic. And we know that clouds play a key role in regulating the Earth climate, but also we don't know it. We know that clouds are very important, but for now we cannot calculate it accurately. What the effect is, how, and we cannot predict it very with little error. But because it's like one of the least understood aspects of climate change, the cloud formation. In general, the clouds can either cool the Earth if the sunlight reflects off the top of the clouds back to space, so less sunlight, less warming. Some type of clouds can also further enhance warming, so they have a completely contradictory effect. If heat from the Earth reflects of the cloud bottoms and returns to the surface, so then the Earth's surface will be even warmer. But in general, DMS is thought to cause creation or enhance formation of those clouds that cool the Earth, because the sunlight reflects of the top of the waters. And this is what four or scientists proposed. Their surnames were Charlson, Lovelock, Andre, and Warren. Thus, CLAW, the first letters of the author's names form this abbreviation CLAW. And the theory CLAW is rather new, I would say, because it was announced, it was proposed in 1987. And basically it says that increasing Earth temperature could lead to increased phytoplankton, increased DMS, but that means that as a result there will be more clouds, more sulfate aerosols, and the temperature would decrease. So this would be an example of so-called negative feedback loop. The climate change would stop, the climate warming would stop itself, would hinder itself with the use of phytoplankton, speaking figuratively. So this is basically the idea of the CLAW theory or CLAW hypothesis, which was, like I said, originally proposed in late 20th century. In the climate change and in climate change studies or research, we know a lot positive feedback loops. That means that the effect enhances the cause even further, and this is like sort of a vicious circle. But in this case, it would be more optimistic, that like a self-control mechanism proposed by the geosystem. The CLAW hypothesis is not 100% confirmed, I would say, or more like quantified. So we don't know exactly what, we don't know for sure what are the differences, what are the results. I mean, how much those clouds formed due to more DMS, more phytoplankton, how much they lower the temperature. So there were numerous measurements, numerous studies, but it has not been clearly confirmed, at least so far. But it's an interesting theory and quite an optimistic one in terms of climate change. And I mentioned the productivity, and this is another feature of phytoplankton, or maybe more of an individual organisms and a group as a whole, that proves that tiny organisms can have a really huge importance, and those the fact that they're so small contributes to the fact how important they are to the geosystem. So they are important. They are responsible for, it is estimated that about 50% of global primary production and at least 80% of global oxygen production. These are just estimates, but this is what's probably more or less true. So the how is it possible? How is it possible that we have so many forests, so many land plants, we have jungles, and we have taiga, and well, taiga is not the best example, but in general we have so many big plants, and still those tiny organisms are responsible for 80% of global oxygen production. Well, the first thing is that there are a lot of them, really a lot of them. But the other thing is that their advantage is that they're really small, and this is of huge importance, especially in aquatic ecosystem. Because if you think that phytoplankton needs to stay close to the euphotic zone, stay close to the surface to have access to sunlight, this means they cannot sink easily. They should not sink easily. They should be able to drift in water, not sink. And this is what happens thanks to the fact that they are so tiny. And if they are so tiny and have this more or less round shape, they have a very large surface, large in relation to their weight and to their volume. And this allows them not to sink, but to can drift and stay close to the sunlight. Also, this shape, this large surface of each and every cell, large in relation to volume and weight, allows them to use the nutrients very efficiently. So the uptake of nutrients from the water, from the surrounding water, is really, really easy and really, really efficient, because they have no roots. They cannot uptake nutrients from soil and anything like that. They're microscopic, so they need to take everything. They uptake everything from the surrounding environment, which is water. But the question is, how do we know it? How do we know all that? Like I mentioned that till the 70s, the phytoplankton was not that well known, especially the photosynthetic bacteria. But what are the methods that are used to study phytoplankton? There are two main groups of methods, and scientists are using satellite observations. And the satellite observations were actually the thing that revolutionized the phytoplankton science, especially Arctic phytoplankton science. And this is this might seem to be very strange because they're so tiny and they're best seen from space. But this is rightly so, because from the space we can perceive them differently, not an individual organism, but the amount of them, which we can also try and calculate. So what we really observe, what scientists really observe using satellite observations, is not the aeronautic phytoplankton, it's the chlorophyll, this pigment I mentioned, green pigment essential for photosynthesis, and they use it as an indicator of phytoplankton efficiency. Especially the type A, that means chlorophyll A, is like an indirect measure of the amount of phytoplankton, and it can represent the weight of phytoplankton per unit volume of water surface. So how is it calculated? There are some special models of algorithms, so-called chlorophyll algorithms, which allow to recalculate these observations of presence of chlorophyll to the amount of phytoplankton. And of course, they're not universal. That means that you cannot use the same algorithm in the Arctic and in the South Pacific. Not at all. They need to be adapted to water type, they need to be adapted to regions, and they're constantly improved to give the most exact response. So these algorithms need to be, of course, verified. How do you know that they're exact, or how exact they are? They need to be verified based on actual results from specific waters. So you need to compare those results with actual amount, not only estimated, but actual amount of phytoplankton in the water. So the measurement, of course, is not perfect, but you need to get the samples somehow, and this is where the second group of methods plays a huge role. There are different types of samplers, from very simple ones to more complicated, more developed, more protected, and this is how the water samples with phytoplankton in it, of course, are probed, are taken out of water and compared with the results of satellite observations. The satellite observations allow us to perceive increases during the spring and then decrease during summer. They can they also allow to observe blooms, which are not always a very good thing. The fact that there is more phytoplankton doesn't only mean that they will thrive or will have more oxygen. That's not always the case. And this is what I would like to end with, like the very delicate relation between climate change and plankton in general. And this time I would like to focus on phytoplankton in particular. So we know that the climate change, especially in the Arctic, when it can be up to 6 times more intense than in other parts of the world, it has some serious effects, like melting ice. There's more melting ice, and the ice starts melting earlier than before. This means a lot of things, and the consequences are not always that obvious, because we might think that, well, there's more melting ice, earlier melting ice, so the bloom are more intense, they're earlier, okay, which is true, and which is also not always good for the system, for the food webs, because this can lead to disrupted cycles and some mismatch with zooplankton cycles, and therefore with other elements of the food web, like, for example, little auks, birds that live in the Arctic. So disrupted food webs influence everything, and also they influence our economy, our human economy, through fisheries, which are very important. Fishery is very important for many countries, and many economies are based on fishery. And those disrupted cycles can decrease number of fish or availability of fish significantly. Also, if there is too much sunlight, it can also be not very beneficial for the phytoplankton. In some cases, too much sunlight can cause maybe not a decrease in amount of phytoplankton, but in the quality of phytoplankton. We might say that they produce less omega-3 acids, for example, which are very important, especially in Arctic ecosystems and Arctic food webs, because those further food web links are based mostly on omega-3 acids. So the effects can vary a lot and are really difficult to predict. Another thing is that it's not only that the climate change affects phytoplankton, it's also that phytoplankton can contribute to climate change. Remember, DMS was an example of negative feedback loop, which is not 100% sure, or the scale of it is not 100% sure. But there are lots of positive feedback loops, like I mentioned. For example, if there is more phytoplankton, there's more chlorophyll. This is how we know there's more phytoplankton. If there's more chlorophyll, that means that very often the albedo lowers. If albedo lowers, there is more absorbed energy, and the temperature of water is growing, and this is an example of a positive feedback loop, increasing and enhancing the climate change effects. So the relation between phytoplankton, which is, as you already know, a great contributor to the atmosphere, to the oxygen and organic matter on our planet, the relations are quite complicated, actually. And thanks to those methods that I mentioned, especially satellite methods, algorithms, and actual sampling from different parts of the ocean, we can try to analyze and assess the scale of those changes and whether they are dangerous to food webs and ecosystem in general, or how dangerous they are. Thank you very much. This is all I wanted to tell you today.
Watch other recordings from webinars on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/EDU-ARCTIC. EDU-ARCTIC 2, From polar research to scientific passion, innovative nature education in Poland and Norway receives a grant of 240,000 euros received from Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway under EEA funds.